April 29th, 1945. It is a Sunday afternoon, 10 miles outside Munich. Soldiers from the 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division move toward the perimeter. They do not run. They walk with the weight of 500 consecutive days of combat. They fought through the beaches of Sicily. They survived the landings at Anzio and Salerno. They pushed across southern France and deep into Germany. The division has lost 75% of its men to casualties. The survivors are exhausted, they are hardened, they are angry. But nothing in 2 years of continuous warfare prepared them for this. First, the wind hits them. A stench rolls over the battalion, heavy and thick. It is physically overpowering. Some soldiers gag, others vomit on the roadside grass. Why was the smell so distinct? Some thought it was a chemical factory, others guessed burning feathers. But the reality was worse. Then they see the source. 39 railway boxcars sit on a siding near the camp entrance. At first glance, an abandoned transport, but in reality, a steel coffin. The soldiers approach. They slide open the heavy doors. Inside, the cars lie the bodies of nearly 2,500 human beings. The footage shows corpses stacked like cordwood, limbs are intertwined, open eyes stare into nothingness. The Americans freeze. These men are veterans. They have seen friends die in the mud. But this is different. This is the Dachau death train. The shock creates a vacuum in the air. Then the shock turns. It becomes pure rage. Hands tighten on rifles. Safety catches click off. What these soldiers found here shattered their understanding of justice. There was no turning back. The war ended here, and revenge began. March 22nd, 1933. On this date, the machinery of terror roared to life. Heinrich Himmler stood in Munich and made the announcement. The location was a defunct munitions factory in Dachau, a quiet Bavarian town just 10 miles from the city center. Himmler spoke clearly. The camp would hold 5,000 people. Who were they? Enemies of the state, communists, socialists, trade unionists, anyone who dared to look the regime in the eye. This was Dachau. It became the prototype for every death camp that followed. Why were they arrested? There were no crimes committed. But the new order did not care about laws. The first transports arrived immediately. Local officials, journalists, union leaders. Within days, the headcount hit 200. Within weeks, 5,000 men packed the barracks. These were not thugs or murderers. They were doctors, lawyers, and writers. Germany's intellectual elite found themselves behind barbed wire, indefinitely, without trial, without charges. In June 1933, the camp found its true master, SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Eicke, a man so unstable he had once been committed to a psychiatric clinic. Hitler saw potential in his madness. He handed Eicke the keys to Dachau. Eicke didn't just run the camp, he reinvented it. He introduced a doctrine of total dehumanization. Names were erased, only numbers remained. The purpose was not rehabilitation, it was destruction through labor. The archives show prisoners standing in perfect rows, stripped of individuality, eyes fixed on the ground. Eicke designed a machine to break the human spirit. He instituted flogging on special wooden benches. The sound of the whip became the camp's soundtrack. 25 lashes, 50, 75. The blows tore skin and shattered kidneys. Many died from shock right there on the wood. He built standing cells, tiny stone boxes where a man could neither sit nor lie down. He stood for days until his legs failed. At first glance, a prison system, but in reality, a laboratory of pain. Discipline was absolute. If one prisoner broke a rule, everyone paid the price. Prisoners were forced to police each other, but Eicke also trained the guards. Pity was a crime. Mercy led to dismissal. Only sadism earned a promotion. The method was effective. Eicke was soon elevated to inspector of all concentration camps. He took his blueprint with him. Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Auschwitz. They all grew from the seeds planted in Dachau. In the first year, the goal was simple intimidation. Break the opposition, then release them. Men returned home as shells of their former selves. Photographs from the time capture the hollow stares of released prisoners. They were walking warnings. Their silence screamed louder than words. Do not resist. Their bodies were damaged and their lives were destroyed. But as Nazi power consolidated, the strategy shifted. By 1935, the net widened. New enemies were identified: Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused to salute Hitler; the Roma people, labeled racially inferior; homosexuals, marked with pink triangles and targeted for extreme abuse; career criminals, branded as asocials. The barracks filled up, but this was only the beginning. Then came November 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Nazi mobs rampaged through German cities, synagogues burned, storefronts shattered. In the aftermath, over 10,000 Jewish men were dragged to Dachau. Newsreels record the columns of men marching through the camp gates, heads bowed. This was a turning point. For the first time, mass imprisonment relied solely on heritage. The treatment of Jewish prisoners was distinct. They were given the filthiest tasks. They faced the harshest beatings. The guards mocked them relentlessly. Many collapsed and died within weeks. Others were offered a grim deal: sign over your property, agree to leave Germany immediately, and you might survive. The regime's message was brutal and clear: there is no place for you here. Leave or die. The camp continued to expand. Leave or die. By 1944, that was the only choice left. Dachau had ceased to be a simple camp. It had mutated into a massive industrial complex. Over 150 sub-camps spread like a web across southern Germany and Austria. Why did the network expand so aggressively? The Reich needed production at any cost. Prisoners were forced into slave labor for the giants of German industry: BMW, Messerschmitt. These corporations profited directly from the starvation of inmates. They worked on armaments. They poured concrete for construction projects. The conditions were engineered for a specific purpose: to kill slowly. The weapon was hunger. Rations were minimal: a bowl of watery soup, a thin slice of bread, sometimes a raw potato. A prisoner received perhaps 1,000 calories per day, but the heavy labor required 3,000 or more. The math was fatal. Bodies began to consume their own muscle tissue. Within weeks, healthy men transformed. They became walking skeletons. Work details were a death sentence. Prisoners hauled heavy granite blocks. They dug ditches in frozen earth. They built roads for 12 to 14 hours a day. Visuals confirm the brutality. In the footage, guards are seen striking men with rifle butts. Beatings happened constantly: whips, clubs, fists. A guard needed no reason to strike. A stumble was enough. A glance was enough. But this was only the beginning. The psychological torture was systematic. Roll calls lasted for hours. Prisoners stood at rigid attention in freezing rain, in snow, in the blistering heat of summer. If a man collapsed from exhaustion, help did not come. He was beaten on the ground or shot where he lay. They were forced to crawl through mud. They were forced to sing songs praising the SS while watching their friends die. At first glance, a strict prison routine, but in reality, a machine designed to break the human spirit. It got worse inside the hospital blocks. Doctors viewed the inmates not as patients, but as biological material. Dr. Sigmund Rascher led the most sadistic experiments. He needed data for the Luftwaffe. To test survival times for pilots downed in the North Sea, he submerged prisoners in tanks of ice water. They remained there for 9 hours. The camera records: a victim shaking violently as ice floats around his neck. Most subjects died in the tank. Those who survived were not spared. They were frozen again. Rascher pushed further. He placed men in pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude flying. He dialed the settings to 68,000 feet. The rapid decompression was devastating. Lungs ruptured, brains hemorrhaged, eardrums exploded. Prisoners screamed in agony as their bodies tore apart from the inside. Rascher filmed every second. The reels remain in the archives today. He also weaponized disease. Inmates were infected with malaria and tuberculosis to test experimental drugs. If the chemical failed, the prisoner died a slow, feverish death. Hundreds were crippled or killed on these tables. Justice eventually found the doctors. Most were tried at Nuremberg and executed. But Rascher never stood trial. Why did he escape the courtroom? Because he betrayed his own code. In 1944, the SS arrested him. He had falsified documents. His career ended not with a gavel, but with a bullet. On Himmler's direct orders, Rascher was shot just days before the war ended. Dachau was not an extermination camp like Treblinka. There were no industrial gas chambers. It was a work camp where death came from the environment, brutality, disease, neglect. That distinction did not save the victims. When American forces arrived in April 1945, the scale of the horror became clear. At least 32,000 prisoners had died in the complex. Thousands more had been shipped away to die elsewhere. The true death toll will never be known. As the Allied tanks approached, the guards burned the files. The history was turned to ash. April 1945. The Third Reich was not just falling, it was disintegrating. Soviet artillery thundered in the east. American tanks rolled through the west. In Berlin, Hitler sat trapped in his bunker, staring at maps that no longer mattered. The war was mathematically lost. But for the prisoners of Dachau, the final weeks brought a new, sharper terror. The SS High Command ordered the evacuation of camps directly in the path of Allied armies, 7,000 inmates. That was the number pulled from Dachau and its subcamps in late April. They were forced onto the roads toward the Austrian Alps. This was not a relocation, it was a death march. Prisoners walked until their hearts stopped. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or starvation did not get back up. Guards finished them with a bullet to the back of the neck. Why did the command structure crumble? Loyalty to the Führer evaporated when the enemy crossed the Rhine. On April 26th, Camp Commandant Martin Weiss made his choice. He did not organize a defense. He packed vehicles with supplies and fled. Most of the regular SS guards followed his lead. They abandoned their posts and ran. Left behind was SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker. He commanded a skeleton crew of approximately 560 personnel. At first glance, a military unit, but in reality, a penal battalion. These were not elite ideologues. They were inmates from the SS disciplinary prison, criminals, troublemakers serving time. Alongside them stood Hungarian Waffen-SS troops who barely spoke German. None of them wanted to fight the Americans. They simply wanted to survive the week. Events accelerated. On April 28th, the town of Dachau erupted in violence. A resistance group led by former prisoners Georg Scherer and Walter Neff seized the town hall. Civilians joined them. Their goal was to prevent the SS from liquidating the remaining prisoners in the camp. But the rebellion was short-lived. Waffen-SS units counterattacked with heavy weapons. By midday, the uprising was crushed. Bodies of resistance fighters lay in the streets. Others fled into hiding. But the worst horror did not happen in the town. It arrived by rail. That same day, April 28th, a train rolled onto a siding near the camp entrance. It had departed Buchenwald concentration camp on April 7th. 5,000 prisoners were packed into 39 boxcars. The SS had provided rations for exactly 1 day. The journey was scheduled for 48 hours. It took 3 weeks. Allied bombing had destroyed the rail network. The train wandered aimlessly through Saxony, Czechia, and Bavaria. It sat idle on damaged tracks for days. Inside the locked cars, there was no food, no water, no sanitation. Men drank their own urine to stay alive. On April 21st, the train halted at Nammering in Lower Bavaria. The doors opened. The living were ordered to unload the dead. They dug shallow graves in the fields nearby. 800 corpses were left in the mud at Nammering. The guards shot anyone who moved too slowly. When the train finally reached Dachau, it was a hearse on wheels. The footage shows silent boxcars standing under the spring sun. Between 2,000 and 3,000 prisoners were dead inside. Only about 800 remained alive, barely breathing among the corpses. The SS guards did not unlock the doors. They did not distribute water. They simply walked away. The train sat there, 39 cars filled with rotting bodies. By the morning of April 29th, the death toll inside the train reached approximately 2,310. Disease took some. Starvation took others. Many simply gave up. The smell was physical. It was a heavy, suffocating wall of stench that drifted hundreds of yards from the tracks. It hung over the camp, waiting for the liberators. April 29th, 1945, dawn. American forces from 3 divisions converged on the perimeter. July 1943. That is when the nightmare began for them. The division landed in Sicily. From there, they fought through the entire Italian campaign, Salerno, Anzio. The casualties were devastating, but the war did not stop. August 1944 brought the invasion of southern France. They pushed through the freezing Vosges Mountains. They crossed into Germany. They smashed through the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line. They had been shot at, shelled, bombed, day after day. They saw friends killed, dismembered, burned alive inside tanks. The division had lost 75% of its original strength. They were not just tired, they were hollowed out, traumatized, angry at the whole world. But then they saw the boxcars, 39 wagons on the tracks. Inside were not supplies, inside were bodies, thousands of murdered civilians. This sight changed everything. It wasn't just war anymore, it was a crime scene. Sergeant Peter Gallery looked at his men. His command was simple. Let's get those Nazi dogs. The order was clear. Take no prisoners. Don't take any SS alive. Why did the rules of war vanish in seconds? These men had followed the Geneva Conventions for 2 years. They had treated captured Germans humanely, even after their own friends died. But here, the logic broke. That sentiment spread through the ranks like a virus. They decided the SS were not soldiers. They were monsters. The protections did not apply here, not after seeing the train. American forces moved past the death train toward the camp. They encountered more SS guards. The chaotic scene unfolded rapidly. Some Germans fled toward the woods. Others tried to surrender. Hands raised, weapons dropped on the dirt. A few still fired from guard towers. The Americans returned fire. Resistance was suppressed quickly. Several guards died in the exchange. These were legitimate combat kills. But then the line blurred. At first glance, a surrender. But in reality, an execution. Guards who gave up were shot anyway. Wounded men were finished off with bullets to the head. The rules of war were disintegrating with every step. By 3 p.m, Brigadier General Henning Linden arrived. He found the command post. There stood SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker. The regular SS had fled. Wicker was left behind to hand over the keys. He surrendered the camp to General Linden. Wicker followed protocol. He expected the Geneva Conventions. He expected interrogation, a holding cell, a trial. But he had miscalculated. Within hours, Wicker was dead. Maybe executed by American soldiers, maybe beaten to death by liberated prisoners. The accounts vary, but the result was the same. He did not survive the day. Linden toured the camp. With him was Marguerite Higgins from the New York Herald Tribune. She was one of the few female war correspondents in Europe. The footage shows she steps over bodies without looking down. What they found inside defied language. The SS had been frantically evacuating camps across Poland. They pushed prisoners westward to escape the Soviets. The camp was designed for 6,000 men. Later, it was expanded for 8,000. Now, it held over 32,000. Every inch was occupied. Barracks built for 250 men now housed 1,600. Wooden bunks were stacked 3 high. 3 or 4 skeletons shared a space meant for 1. There was no room to turn over, no room to stretch. Men slept sitting up. Some slept standing. Starvation had done its work. The SS had stopped providing food weeks ago. The ovens could not keep up. In the frame, bodies stacked like firewood outside the crematorium. The smell was physical. Decomposing corpses, overflowing latrines. Soldiers described it as hell on earth. Inside the barracks, the silence was heavy. Emaciated prisoners lay on the wood, too weak to stand. Many were dying of typhus. The disease was spread by lice. It caused high fevers and delirious headaches. Sanitation had collapsed entirely. Others coughed up their lungs from tuberculosis. Years of breathing factory fumes had destroyed them. Dysentery dehydrated the rest. The air tasted of decay. American soldiers walked through in stunned silence. Some vomited right there on the path. Some cried openly. They did not care who saw the tears. Rage contorted their faces. One soldier wrote home that week. He summed it up in one sentence. "I have seen death before, but I have never seen murder." April 29, 1945. The ink was barely dry on the letter when the soldier sent it home. Why did the discipline of professional soldiers collapse in a single hour? They were trained to follow orders. But what they found behind the gates broke their minds. The soldier wrote, "I have seen death before, but I have never seen murder on this scale." He did not use the word war. He called it slaughter. Evil made real. Marguerite Higgins typed her report on a portable machine. It would hit newspapers across America within days. The words were stark. The footage shows thousands of eyes staring through the barbed wire. They are bloodshot, disbelieving. The reaction was instant. The crowd did not just cheer, they erupted. A tremendous roar shook the fence. The last vestiges of camp discipline vanished. Men wept, women screamed, they howled at the sky. In the frame, bodies like skeletons, skin stretched over bone. Many were too weak to stand, but adrenaline took over. They found the strength to run. Prisoners surged toward the Americans. They broke through the wooden barriers. They grabbed the soldiers. They embraced them. They kissed their dusty boots. They lifted the GIs onto their bony shoulders. It was a chaos of languages: Polish, Russian, French, German, Italian, Hungarian, Dutch, Czech. They tried to speak. Broken English mixed with hand gestures. Some fell to their knees in the dirt, sobbing uncontrollably. Others danced. They linked arms, spinning in circles, ignoring their starvation until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion. For 32,000 people, liberation was not just politics, it was survival. They had made it. They had endured years of torture. They had survived the hunger, the disease. They watched friends die in the mud. They wondered every day if the smoke from the chimney was for them. And they survived. But for the American soldiers, the perspective shifted. Seeing Dachau changed everything. It wasn't just a war against an enemy army anymore. It wasn't about territory. It wasn't about ideology. It was a war against a system that built factories to incinerate human beings, a system where people created hell and called it necessary. The soldiers looked at the piles of bodies. They looked at the walking corpses, and something inside them snapped. That's when the killing began. Lieutenant William P. Walsh commanded Company Wine, 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Division. He stood near the back entrance of the camp. He spotted a boxcar. Inside, 4 German soldiers waited. They had already surrendered to other American troops. The visual evidence is clear. The Germans had their hands raised. They held no weapons. They were prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention guaranteed their safety. Walsh should have processed them. He should have sent them to the rear for interrogation. He should have walked away. But Walsh had just walked past the death train outside the camp. He had seen hundreds of corpses stacked in wagons. The smell of death was in his lungs. He looked at the 4 Germans. He decided they didn't deserve to breathe. Walsh pulled out his .45 caliber pistol. He didn't hesitate. He shot all 4 dead, one after another, execution style. Private Albert C. Pruitt stood nearby. He saw movement in the boxcar. He climbed inside. He performed the coup de grace. He put bullets into the heads of the wounded Germans. He finished them off. This was murder. Clear, unambiguous, premeditated. The Germans were disarmed. Shooting them violated every rule of warfare. It violated every principle the United States claimed to defend. But Walsh didn't care. The camp had erased the rules. Other American soldiers witnessed the shooting. They said nothing. Some nodded. Some checked their own weapons. The violence was contagious. It got worse. Under the camp's coal yard, the situation exploded. A group of SS guards had surrendered or been captured. American soldiers herded them together. They placed them against a wall. At first glance, a standard prisoner transfer, but in reality, a firing squad. Accounts vary on the trigger, but the result is undisputed. Someone opened fire. It might have been Lieutenant Walsh again. It might have been others from the 45th. Detailed reports state, machine gun fire raked the coal yard. The sound of automatic fire drowned out the orders. SS guards fell screaming. Some died instantly. Others hit the black dust, wounded, crying for help. The Americans didn't stop. They walked through the fallen guards. They shot the wounded in the head. Pistol shots at close range. Blood pooled on the coal yard floor, mixing with the black dust. Bodies piled up. The killing continued until Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks arrived. He saw the carnage. He ordered it stopped. How many died in the coal yard? The number remains a historical fog. 79 years later, the controversy persists. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks commanded the 3rd Battalion. He later claimed he arrived after hearing the first burst. He stopped his men immediately. His estimate, 16 SS guards killed, 1 more killed by a liberated prisoner who grabbed a rifle. Total, 17. Lieutenant Colonel Walter J. Fellens filed an official report for the 7th Army weeks later. His count, 17 guards killed. These numbers suggest a brief loss of control, a momentary lapse, but other witnesses tell a darker story. Howard A. Buechner was the chief medical officer of the 45th Infantry Division. He was there. In 1986, he published a book, The Hour of the Avenger. His claims were explosive. Buechner agreed that 30 SS guards died in combat before the surrender, but his numbers for the executions were different. He claimed 122 guards were executed immediately after capture, scattered across the camp. And at the coal yard, Buechner pointed to Tower B. He alleged that 346 SS guards were lined up against the walls. He claimed they were machine-gunned to death in a mass execution. He went further. He claimed 40 more guards were beaten to death by prisoners while Americans watched. Buechner's total, 538 SS guards killed in summary executions on April 29th. If accurate, this number changes history. It would make the Dachau Massacre one of the largest war crimes by American forces in Europe. But there is a problem. Most historians reject Buechner's numbers. They call them exaggerated, fabricated. Why? The evidence contradicts him. Buechner's own sworn statement from May 1945 was declassified in 1987. It surfaced 1 year after his book. In that statement, given just 2 weeks after the event, the numbers were different. The massive piles of 500 bodies were missing from the record. The investigation began. 15 or 16. That was the number Buechner gave to investigators just 2 weeks after the liberation. The events were fresh. The smell of gunpowder still hung in his memory. He stated clearly that he saw only a handful of Germans shot by American soldiers, not 538, not 346, 15 or 16. 30 years passed. Buechner wrote a book. Suddenly, the math changed. The number on the page swelled to over 500 executed men. When challenged on this massive discrepancy, Buechner offered a defense. He claimed he had lied to the Army in 1945. He said he perjured himself to protect his fellow soldiers from court-martial. He insisted his book, written decades later, contained the real truth. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. Why trust the faded memory of an elderly man over the sworn testimony of a young officer at the scene? In 1986, Buechner was old. In 1945, he was there. Logic dictates the first account is the reliable one. There's also the problem of physical evidence. If 538 guards were gunned down in a mass systematic killing, the bodies would not vanish. The U.S. Army Signal Corps documented the liberation of Dachau with obsessive detail. Cameramen and photographers were everywhere. They did not look away. The footage shows the death train sitting on the tracks, filmed from multiple angles, the camera records, the interior of the barracks and the cold ovens of the crematorium. In the frame, liberated prisoners cheering and emaciated bodies piled in the yard. We have hundreds of photographs from April 29, 1945. The archives are full. There are photos of dead SS guards. They lie at the base of guard towers. They lie in the moat. But there is a void in the record. There are no photographs of 346 bodies lined up against a wall. There are no images of a mass execution pit. If such a slaughter happened, the photographers would have snapped the shutter. They filmed everything else. They would have documented this either as evidence of a crime or a trophy of victory. The absence of these photos raises a deafening doubt about Buechner's claims. But the doubts didn't stop there. Independent investigations began immediately. The U.S. Third Army did not sweep this under the rug. They sent teams to Dachau within days. Investigators interviewed dozens of American soldiers. They spoke to officers. They examined the bodies on the ground. They documented the crime scenes with forensic precision. They had no reason to minimize the count. In fact, they had every incentive to report the full extent of the violence so discipline could be restored. At first glance, a potential massacre of hundreds, but in reality, a chaotic series of smaller incidents. The most credible estimate, backed by ballistics and witnesses, puts the number between 30 and 50. American soldiers killed 30 to 50 SS guards in various spots around the camp. This is still significant. This is still a war crime, but it is nowhere near the 538 claimed in Buchner's book. The most thorough inquiry came from Lieutenant Colonel Joseph M. Whitaker. He was the Assistant Inspector General of the 7th Army. On May 2, 1945, the order came down. Major General Arthur White demanded a formal investigation into the mistreatment of German guards. Whitaker did not waste time. He arrived at Dachau on May 3rd. He spent weeks on site. He interviewed witnesses while the blood was still on the ground. His report was finished on June 8, 1945. It was titled, "Investigation of Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau." It was cold, detailed, and factual. According to Whitaker, American troops shot approximately 16 SS guards in the coal yard. One more died at the hands of an inmate. 17 guards died at Tower B. A few others were picked off in isolated locations. The total killed by U.S. troops, approximately 30 to 40. The report noted that liberated prisoners killed another 25 to 50 guards. Whitaker made one thing clear. These were summary executions. These were not combat deaths. The SS men had surrendered. They were unarmed prisoners of war. Killing them violated the Geneva Convention. But here is where the story twists. Who were these dead men? Were they the monsters who ran the camp? The answer is uncomfortable. The investigation revealed that the guards killed by the Americans were not the long-term tormentors of Dachau. The regular SS personnel had fled. Commandant Weiss and his elite unit escaped on April 26th. They saw the writing on the wall. The men left behind were replacements. Some were inmates from an SS disciplinary prison. Others were Hungarian Waffen-SS troops who had been transferred to Dachau only days prior. Most had never worked a shift in a concentration camp. They had never gassed a prisoner. They were just unlucky enough to be wearing the uniform when the Americans arrived. Were they innocent? No. They stood guard at a death factory, but they were not the architects of the horror. The true sadists had already vanished into the forests. The Americans took their revenge on the wrong men. April 29, 1945. The killing did not stop at the gate. American troops, fueled by the sight of the death train and the stench of the camp, opened fire on anyone in an SS uniform. Individual guilt didn't matter. The uniform itself was a death warrant. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the battalion responsible for the sector. Years later, he wrote about that day. His words held a mix of pride and regret. He insisted the rage was unstoppable. Why did the discipline collapse? The soldiers had seen the train cars piled with bodies. The shock broke the chain of command. But when Sparks heard the crack of rifles in the coal yard, he moved. He didn't just shout orders. He sprinted toward the firing line. He drew his service pistol. He aimed it directly at his own men. "Stop or I shoot." The threat hung in the air. The soldiers lowered their rifles. According to Sparks, the executions ended there. He estimated the toll, 30 to 50 guards dead. For the rest of his life, he defended his men. To him, the horrors of the camp justified the bullets. But the Americans were not the only executioners. Liberated prisoners sought their own justice. An American chaplain recorded a confession. 3 young Jewish men found a sadistic SS guard hiding in a barn. He was dressed as a peasant to escape detection. It didn't save him. They beat him until he stopped breathing. Other witnesses described a frenzy. Prisoners grabbed anything they could find. Shovels, clubs, heavy stones from the road. The camera records, a chaotic blur of striped uniforms and field gray. Some guards were thrown against concrete walls. Others were stomped into the mud until they ceased moving. Polish prisoner Walenty Lenarchuk watched the scene unfold. Prisoners swarmed over the wire fences. They lifted the Americans onto their shoulders in celebration. Then they turned on the Germans. They knocked the SS men down. The crowd swarmed them. Lenarchuk noted the grim irony. We were animals to them for years. Now it was our birthday. The exact number of guards killed by prisoners remains unknown. Estimates range from a dozen to over 50. In the chaos of liberation, escape was impossible. Those who stayed were torn apart. One witness saw two prisoners swinging a shovel. They didn't stop until the guard was dead. Another saw a prisoner stomping on a guard's face. He stomped repeatedly until the features were erased. These were not combat deaths. These were lynchings, mob justice. At first glance, liberation, but in reality, a massacre. The American soldiers did not intervene. In many cases, they facilitated the slaughter. Some handed rifles to the prisoners. Others stood guard, ensuring the beatings continued uninterrupted. Some simply turned their backs and looked at the sky. The liberation of Dachau had become a bloodbath. And here lies the impossible question. Were these killings justified? To the soldiers and the prisoners, the answer was yes. These guards wore the skull insignia. Even the replacements who had arrived days earlier represented the system. They guarded a facility of systematic murder. The corpse-filled train proved their guilt. The starvation in the barracks proved their guilt. Shooting them wasn't murder. It felt like justice. But international law says no. The Geneva Conventions are clear. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely. Summary execution is a war crime. Revenge violates the line between civilization and barbarism. If soldiers execute without trial, the rule of law collapses. They become the very evil they fight against. American military leadership understood the danger immediately. Major General Arthur White did not hesitate. He ordered an investigation just 3 days after the liberation. Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker spent weeks gathering facts. He documented every bullet. The U.S. Army knew the truth. Its soldiers had committed war crimes. The only question was the punishment. Whitaker's report named names. A soldier named Walsh admitted to shooting 4 Germans in a boxcar. Witness statements identified others. There was enough evidence for court-martials. But Whitaker also saw the context. These men were broken. They had been in combat for over 500 consecutive days. 3/4 of their division were dead or wounded. They had watched their friends die in the mud of Europe. Then they walked into Dachau. They saw the death train. They smelled the burning flesh. They saw the evidence of systematic extermination. The psychological weight was crushing. December 31st, 1945. That was the day the file was officially closed. Colonel Charles L. Decker sat at his desk and made the final call. He held the Whitaker report in his hands. The pages detailed systematic executions. The evidence was irrefutable. But Decker did not sign a warrant. He wrote a memo. He admitted the facts. American troops had violated international law. They had shot SS guards without trial. But then came the pivot. Decker argued that justice could not be blind to what those soldiers saw. The conditions at Dachau were beyond human comprehension. To punish the liberators for their rage was deemed impossible. Why did the army look away? The law was clear, but the horror was clearer. The investigation ended there. No courts-martial were convened. No handcuffs clicked onto American wrists. The soldiers who lined up Germans against the coal yard wall went home free. The U.S. Army labeled the massacre understandable, perhaps even inevitable. This decision sparked a firestorm. Critics saw a double standard. How could the Allies prosecute Nazis at Nuremberg for war crimes while ignoring their own? It looked like victor's justice. At first glance, a legal failure. But in reality, a recognition of the breaking point of the human mind. Defenders of the decision drew a hard line. There was a difference. The SS ran a death factory for 12 years. They murdered tens of thousands through starvation, gas, and medical torture. It was calculated, industrial evil. The Americans spent 2 hours in that hell before snapping. They killed 30 to 50 guards in a spasm of shock. One was genocide, the other was revenge. Lieutenant Jack Walsh never offered an excuse. He was the man who shot 4 surrendered Germans in the boxcar. He didn't lose sleep over it. In a 1990 interview, Walsh sat before the lens. The camera records, an old man, defiant, eyes hard. He said the SS guards knew exactly why they were dying. "When I get to hell, I'll check it out," he told the reporter. "I'll find out if they knew." He lived his entire life believing he did the right thing. General Eisenhower saw the reason for that rage firsthand. April 12, 1945. Eisenhower walked into Ohrdruf concentration camp. The smell hit him first. Then he saw the piles of bodies. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces felt physically ill, but he refused to look away. He realized immediately that the world would eventually deny this happened. He needed witnesses. The things I saw beggar description, Eisenhower wrote. He knew future generations would call this propaganda. So he took action. He issued a command: bring the Germans here. Military police rounded up civilians from nearby towns. They were marched at gunpoint through the gates. They were forced to walk past the death train. They were pushed into the crematoriums to see the ovens. Then came the shovels. The civilians were ordered to dig graves for 9,000 corpses. Some claimed they didn't know. Others said they heard rumors but stayed silent. The sight of the camp destroyed their denial. Women fainted. Men vomited on their boots. They collapsed from the sheer scale of the atrocity. 79 years later, the questions still haunt historians. First, should American soldiers have been prosecuted? The Army cited extenuating circumstances, but does trauma justify a war crime? Second, were the prisoners wrong to kill their guards? The law says yes, but try telling that to a living skeleton who survived years of torture. Should they have shown mercy to monsters? Third, does fighting evil allow us to use evil methods? Every generation must answer this. The soldiers at Dachau made their choice. They decided the SS deserved no mercy. Their commanders agreed. The government moved on. But on April 29, 1945, those men crossed a line. They stopped being liberators. They became executioners. And the question remains, what would you have done? Picture it. You have spent 500 days in combat. You have lost 3/4 of your friends to German bullets. You turn a corner and the smell of rotting meat chokes you. You see 39 boxcars filled with 2,300 corpses. You walk into the camp and see 32,000 starving ghosts. You see 9,000 unburied bodies rotting in the sun. And then you see the men responsible. They are standing there in clean SS uniforms. Would you recite the Geneva Convention? Would you process them as prisoners of war? Or would you do exactly what those soldiers did? The rifle is in your hands. The trigger feels light. Thus ended the Dachau Massacre. April 29, 1945. On this date, the laws of war collapsed in a single afternoon. The Dachau Massacre forces us to stare directly at the gap between law and morality, between what is written in the books and what happens when the shooting starts. The executed men were SS guards, 30 to 50 of them lined up against a wall. Technically, they had committed no specific crime that the American soldiers witnessed that morning. They stood there. They wore the uniform. They surrendered. Under the Geneva Convention, they were prisoners of war, but they were part of a machine that had ground millions of people into ash, and the Americans holding the rifles decided that was enough. Why did discipline shatter so quickly? These were trained soldiers, but the smell of the camp destroyed their training. The stench of rotting flesh was stronger than military code. The U.S. Army investigated. Files were opened, testimony was recorded, then everything stopped. The case was closed without a single charge filed. The lesson was brutal but clear. Sometimes, in the face of absolute evil, good men do terrible things. Sometimes those things are punished, but often they are ignored. And history writes the killers down as heroes. The soldiers who liberated Dachau are rightfully called heroes. They ended 12 years of Nazi tyranny in that sector. They saved 32,000 starving prisoners. They walked into hell and dragged people out. They witnessed the Holocaust firsthand, so the world could not deny it later. They are remembered for the liberation, not the execution. But this was only the beginning. We cannot sanitize the record. We cannot pretend the day was purely heroic. Liberation and revenge happened simultaneously. Freedom and murder, justice and war crimes, all in the same hour, in the same coal yard, by the same hands. At first glance, a military victory, but in reality, a breakdown of civilization. The trigger was the death train. It sat on the tracks outside the camp. 39 rail cars filled with corpses, 2,310 dead bodies. The Americans saw it. They smelled it. This train sits in our collective memory as a symbol of genocide. But it is also a reminder of how thin the line is between a soldier and a savage. The camera records. American GIs staring into the open train cars. Their faces are pale. Hands grip their weapons until the knuckles turn white. The shock turns into a cold, hard rage. On that day, Americans liberated a camp and executed prisoners without trial. Both facts are true. Both facts are necessary. We remember this not to condemn these men, but to understand the mechanics of war. War does not just destroy buildings, it rots the soul. It forces choices where every option is a nightmare. These soldiers were not born monsters, they were young men. Most were in their 20s. They had fought for 2 years straight. They had seen friends blown apart. Then they walked into Dachau and saw the ultimate crime. The psychological dam broke. The investigation vanished because the army made a calculation. What purpose would a court-martial serve? Why put men on trial who had walked into a nightmare and reacted with human rage? It would destroy lives without bringing justice. So they burned the papers, but this decision created a heavy precedent. It implied that war crimes are acceptable if the provocation is extreme enough. It suggested that rules do not apply when you are fighting the devil. This makes us uncomfortable. It should, because it strips away the myth of the clean war. War is chaos, war is brutality, and sometimes the liberators pull the trigger on unarmed men. In the frame, the bodies of the SS guards lie in the dirt. Snow mixes with blood. The Americans stand over them, smoking cigarettes. How many other stories like this exist? The archives are full of closed files. World War II had thousands of dark corners that were never illuminated. But Dachau was documented. The 2,310 dead on the train matter. The 32,000 survivors matter. And the soldiers who killed the guards matter. We must remember them all. Not with simple fairy tales about good versus evil, but with the gritty, uncomfortable complexity of real history. Because the truth is hard. April 29th was a day of salvation and slaughter. 79 years later, the questions remain. The photographs exist. The reports exist. When does justice turn into revenge? When does a liberator become a criminal? The answer is terrifying. It happens when a good man sees a death train. That is not an excuse. It is simply what happened. Thus ended the day at Dachau, not with a gavel, but with a gunshot.